The Beach Boys are summer. The Beach Boys are fun. No! Ladies and gentlemen, yeah, they might be the pinnacle example of a consumerist band with their accessible and timely pop melodies implanting a vision of a dreamlike California into the minds of any that hear it. But they also take turns into dark psychedelia, lost art, hopelessness, deprivation, death, the tensions of fame, and so much more. I said I was working on something big, and while I guess the working might be in question, the big is not in question, because I've pretty much spent my entire life researching this video. Because when I was growing up, I did not like the Beach Boys. I thought their music was incredibly sappy, naive, and honestly, I was embarrassed to listen to them. And while sure, I can blame the media for the way that they twist and pervert the band's image, it really just came down to my own preconceptions of the band, and lack of interest in learning more about them. But eventually I did take that journey, ladies and gentlemen, and now it is time for me to impose it upon you. Aren't you so glad? That was a Beach Boys reference, by the way. Because let me tell you what, a lot of the lore around the Beach Boys narrative is downright incorrect. Not just from the popular media narrative spin, but from supposed die-hard fans that have simply been told a false account of the story. And part of this video I thought would be the fun of sharing the music, the part of playing the music in the video. But this is YouTube.com, and YouTube.com doesn't like fair use. Am I caving in? No, but I might be distorting some of these songs so beyond recognizability that hopefully it's going to be entertaining, but we'll see how that goes for us. This story almost begins in 1961, but I'm going to start there because that's where I want to begin. And we have a cast of 6 specific characters. Brian Wilson, his father Murray, his 2 brothers, Carl and Dennis, his cousin Mike Love, and their good friend Al Jardine. These are the Pendletones. The general synopsis of the inception of this band originated from the fellas' love for jazz and R&B music. And I will admit that I use the phrase, the fellas, a little lightly, because it seems that even from the beginning, the main source of inspiration was Brian, the oldest of the brothers. And Brian more or less inspired and helped the others gain a similar appreciation. They would join their voices and attempt to sing harmonies of complex pop songs of the time. And because they were, for the most part, family, they would be recognized by Murray Wilson, and he saw so much potential from the fellas that, as the Wilsons' father, he would come on as their manager, even founding the band's publishing company with Brian. And so the Beach Boys were born. Not really, because they were still the Pendletones, okay? In the beginning of the band, Carl and Dennis didn't even know how to play instruments, but with some quick practice and fairly simplistic songwriting, the group would release their first single in January 1962 as a song called Surfin. Dennis, who just so happened to be a bit of a rebellious child, suggested that the group record a song about surfing because it was a sport that he had recently become engrossed with, and he saw it as culturally significant. Now, for some reason, it's pretty widely believed that Surfin' is the first song that Brian ever wrote, and even Brian contests that fact, so we'll get there soon enough. It was, however, the band's first release, and when I say the band, I am, of course, referring to the Beach Boys and not the Pendletones because the record company changed their name without even consulting them. But anyway, Surfin' actually charted on the Billboard. Not particularly well, but still, it was significant enough to where the fellas heard their own song played on the radio. And so it was inevitable that the band that is now known as the Beach Boys would release their debut album in October 1962, Surfin Safari.
Let's go surfing now, everybody's learning how. Come on a safari with me. Come on a safari with me. Early in the morning we'll be starting now.
Would you believe it if I told you that there was already some lineup changes between the debut single and the debut record? So Al Jardine, who played upright bass on Surfin', left the band before the recording of this album. He did not, however, leave to pursue dentistry. Now, believe it or not, a lot of people actually think that that is why he left the band. But no, he actually allegedly left because of creative differences with the style that the band was going for. Al apparently wished for a more folky, traditional sound, where the band was quite obviously moving in a more rock direction. And instead, the fellas brought in the Wilsons' neighbor, David Marks. And the band is here. Brian on bass, Carl and David on guitars, Dennis on drums, and then there's Mike, who he pretty much only sang, but that's fine. And the songwriting that resulted from these efforts would often involve Brian orchestrating an idea with instrumental concepts and having someone else help write the lyrics. Now, of course, this wouldn't always be the case, and there are plenty of examples of Brian writing lyrics himself. But typically in these early days, either Mike Love or a man by the name of Gary Usher would help with the writing. Now, Gary Usher was not a part of the band, but he did work as a collaborator with the Beach Boys and other comparable groups at the time, such as Dick Dale. But here we have it, Surfin Safari, and the band is starting so strong, releasing a summer surfing album as far away from summer as physically possible in October. And this comment from everyone's favorite website sums it up pretty well as music to chug root beer to. I think anyone really looking at this record critically would find it hard to rate it particularly well. The lyrics, writing, and arrangements all sound fairly amateurish, and there's nothing really to write home about. But at the same time, maybe there is. After all, it's known that while Brian Wilson wasn't credited as a producer, he very much acted as one, taking a substantial amount of creative control and working on this record, not only producing the whole thing, but also arranging it, showing that even from the beginning, Brian took his job very seriously and fully intended on creating the best album he could. And admittedly, musically, it is a mesmerizing indication of the far less cynical world of the very early 60s, where music like this could be created and would actually be played and listened to instead of being ridiculed into submission, which I think would be undeniable today. I mean, Carl was only 15 when this record was recorded, but at the same time, don't let anyone remind you that Mike Love was already a father. The songs are short and memorable, and that is undoubtable, as I think just about anyone knows or remembers something like the title track. 409 marks the first appearance of a car-centered song in the band's chronology, and there are even moments of melancholy here as well, such as Cuckoo Clock. In fact, the name of the record is just about the most surfy thing about it. There are only 2 songs on this record that have anything to do with surfing. Speaking of which, Surfin was also included on this record, and it is such a great marker for the progression of this band, because I mean, just listen to it. I mean, can I say that it almost sounds like it was recorded by a cult at gunpoint? And, you know, even compared to some of the other tracks here, and especially on future releases, we just see how quickly the band would improve in confidence alone. But even though there is surprising diversity, ambition, and growth in confidence shown throughout this record, I don't think that'll make anyone believe that it's some masterpiece or some spark of genius that is born. And I think that really you'll either find it charming or not like it much at all. But at the time, this surf rock style was ever popular, and this record was no different. In fact, it sold remarkably well and was a definite success for the band, and as such, it wasn't too long before they were back producing a follow-up. The band was so prolific, in fact, that in just 5 months, they would release their first of what would be 3 records in 1963, Surfin U.S.A.
You see 'em wearing their baggies, Warachi sandals too, a bushy blonde hair, Surfin U.S.A. You'll catch 'em surfing at
Here's the group that started the surf dancing craze all over the country, even in places where the nearest thing to surf is maybe the froth on a chocolate shake. Thank you very much, liner notes. Even though that isn't necessarily true, surf rock singles were just about everywhere at this time, but the Beach Boys were certainly one of the first examples of a successful album that would qualify under this sound. And here we have exactly that, the band's full dive into pure, unadulterated surf rock. Admittedly, the general sound and atmosphere of this record is very similar to Surfin Safari, but the songs here occupy 2 very distinct subsects of the band. Firstly, I think it's safe to say that there is an undeniable improvement in songcraft in the writing and performing songs on this record. You listen to something like Farmer's Daughter and it sounds beautiful, lush, full, and earnest. The vocal arrangements are much more intuitive and the performance is undoubtedly more confident than just about anything off the debut. But, as mentioned, there is a substantial, almost overbearing emphasis on surf music here, certainly more than on the debut. 5 of these songs are instrumental jams, and 3 of the instrumental jams are covers. And none of these covers are even famous surfer rock song Wipeout, though don't worry, we will get there eventually. I mean, the fact that these songs are instrumentals already impedes them from the signature Beach Boys vocal harmonies and melodies that we've sort of come to love at this point. But the fact that 3 of them are covers, and pretty much one-for-one covers, it can really make this record feel tiresome and uninspired. But of course, you have Surfin U.S.A., which is an undeniable upbeat surf rock staple. Brian, of course, taking Chuck Berry's Sweet Little 16 and turning it into a surf surf rock anthem. So much so that it is arguably more well known today than the Chuck Berry original. But of course, that didn't stop the band from getting sued for Berry's writing credits. And of course, funny story about this song, Jan and Dean, another famous surf rock vocal group of the time, met with Brian at some party or other gathering around this time, and Brian played them the song Surfin U.S.A., the song that he was working on at the time. And apparently Jan and Dean liked it so much that they wanted to record it. But Brian said that he would rather keep the song, but instead he gave them a song called Surf City for them to record. Well, as luck would have it, Surf City charted at #1 on the Billboard for Jan and Dean, being Brian's first song that he wrote to hit #1, that he gave away. Apparently, a few people were not too happy with this business decision, including Brian's dad, who was not the most well-liked individual, but we'll get to the context of Papa Wilson in a little bit too. As far as Surfin' USA goes, I don't think that this is a particularly great album, but more of just another necessary step in the band's evolution. They got to beat their surf rock persona to death, while also indicating a clear progression in songwriting. Though, at the time, no faults of this record stopped it from being a massive success. I mean, it peaked at #2 on the US Billboard chart. And already in just 2 years since the group's very beginnings, they had pretty much carved their own spot into the culture. And in just 6 months, the band would return with Surfer Girl. Now, it could be pretty easy to say that this record is a natural continuation from where the band was heading, because it is. However, this is not the pure surf rock like the previous album. In fact, I would argue that this is by far the band's most diverse record yet, starting off with the ballad that is Surfer Girl. Of course, one of their most well-known songs, Surfer Girl, is a real classic in their discography, but it's also, according to Brian, the first song he ever wrote. And you know, Brian was rarely a particularly poetic lyricist, but as a song, it's hard to get more perfectly succinct and classic than something like Surfer Girl, especially as the first song that he ever wrote. And then, of course, you have something like In My Room. In My Room is perhaps Brian's first showcase of real vulnerability on an album, and it's rightly known as another one of the band's best songs from this era. But on the other hand, this isn't just a one-note ballad record, even though those are some of the more popular songs, because you have moments of surf rock jamming, such as Rockin' Surfer, and car songs here too, of course, with the ever-famous Little Deuce Coupe. This album showcases the first time where Brian would incorporate a string section into a song with the Surfer Moon, and would be the first album to receive an official production credit attributed to Brian. And really, this is starting to turn into Brian's band. And even though he has had substantial control from the beginning, things start to change here even more, because for the first time, he has access to session players for the record. At the time, it was very common for vocal groups to neither write nor even play on their own songs, making the Beach Boys somewhat of an anomaly in both camps. When it comes to performances, it was typical for session players to come in, supply the instrumental, and give the vocalists their ground to stand on. And not only did Brian have his perfectly decent band to play on these songs, but we also have performances from members of the Wrecking Crew here. That's right, the Wrecking Crew are now famous group of session players. At the time, they were completely unknown to the general public, and were much more of like a secret producer's weapon of many a 60s single. This shows their first appearance on a Beach Boys recording, and it is so noticeable. Again, we can have a comparison. Think back to Surfin', and compare it to the very structurally similar Hawaii from this record. Both songs are driven by a groove, and focus on a fairly simple idea, but even barring the remarkable change in vocal arrangement and sophistication in melody, the drums on Hawaii are incredibly propulsive, rhythmic, and lively, undoubtedly due in part to help from Hal Blaine, who of course was a member of the Wrecking Crew, and it gives the song such personality and depth that was just missing from some of the band's earlier songs. Now, this isn't to say that Dennis was an incompetent player, but rather that sometimes different people are better suited to different styles. And in this case, Brian had the option of a variety of musicians, and was able to arrange with more freedom. But speaking of Beach Boys, Al is back, but this time he's here to stay. From a modern perspective, there are admittedly a lot of elements on this album that still lean a little bit close to novelty. However, as a novelty, or as an example of pure pop songwriting, Surfer Girl is a very special record to many of Beach Boys fans, and deservedly so. This is only record 2 released in 1963, so you can only imagine what the boys had cooking, just waiting for us. But no need to heed your anticipation, because we just had 3 weeks to wait. Just 3 weeks after Surfer Girl is released, the band releases their car concept album, Little Deuce Coupe. Now, I hear what you're all saying. You're saying, Little Deuce Coupe? I know that. That's hit Beach Boys song from hit album Surfer Girl. And you're right. In fact, if you're listening along, you will know 4 of these songs from previous records. This makes for one of an almost countless number of really strange records that exist in the Beach Boys and family catalog. And somehow this is far from the goofiest. And I would call that slightly strange behavior. You know, releasing a third of your album with songs that we already knew and that we've already purchased. Though it should be noted that Brian allegedly wanted to save Little Deuce Coupe and Our Car Club for this album, but his dad, Murray Wilson, insisted that they would be included on both Surfer Girl and this record. Sounds like a strange hill to battle over, but I guess that's fine. Oh wait, no, because look at that. David Marks has an argument with Murray Wilson and quits the band. Some say that Murray was annoyed with David's behavior, and other sources indicate that David's parents took issue with the money management situation with the band. But regardless, David Marks is out of the Beach Boys. But anyways, yes, those 2 tracks from Surfer Girl along with 409 and Shutdown from their 2 prior records are here too. And they are exactly as you would remember. The other thing with this album is it is an incredibly mixed bag. You can clearly see incredibly interesting melodic ideas take place on various songs. Cherry Cherry Coupe is one of my favorites. Like, sure, it's super goofy and almost laughable, but that is in part of just because of how perfectly designed and arranged the song is, and then you just got Mike basically singing his love to his car. But the fact that 4 of these songs we already know, some like 409, are incredibly rudimentary, and can be a real slog when put into the context of this record, among some much more sophisticated tracks. And on top of that, do you really want to listen to an album about cars for the whole runtime? If you do, then good, go have fun. If you don't, good news! Be True to Your School is on this album, a song that has nothing to do with cars, and thank you very much, because I fully believe that this song is on par with some of the band's best material yet. Sue me! It has such a strange melodic progression, and the lyrics are just goofy enough to add a dichotomy with the incredibly triumphant music singing about school pride. If the style of hot rod rock, that's right, I'm not afraid to call it what it is, hot rod rock, ladies and gentlemen. If that sounds tolerable to you, then you will probably love this. But if not, I don't think this record is going to win anyone over. That said, the Beach Boys have won the world over. The boys were making a substantial name for themselves in the music industry while the culture around them was just as accepting. Even now, it's easy to think of the early 60s California scene as a picture-perfect representation of the Beach Boys culture. And on top of that, they were just on fire. Top 10 hit after top 10 hit, massive selling singles and records. Everything couldn't be going better for them and the image of the California dream. But here comes a bit of a shifting tide. November 1963. The assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Now, I can't tell you how much of an impact this had on the fellas on a personal scale, but I can tell you how much of a cultural impact it had by just looking around. People are still talking about it today. And to be as general as possible, it started making a very specific change in the culture of the United States. All of a sudden, there was a brief but incredibly influential moment of chaos amid the hippie dream, for lack of a better term. And slowly but surely, the dark side of the 1960s would emerge. And on a more direct and personal note, Brian gets engaged in December. And while yeah, that relationship never culminated in marriage, this was certainly a remarkable time in the young man's life, both personally and culturally. So how did the Beach Boys fare? Well, the first thing they did was release a Christmas single, so that's a pretty sick move. Yeah, Little Saint Nick was released in December 1963 as sort of a one-off, backed with The Lord's Prayer. And you know what? If I have to listen to a popular Christmas song, Little Saint Nick isn't that bad of a choice, as it's pretty much just the same quality of arrangement Brian has been working towards that just so happens to have Christmas-themed lyrics. But hold on, look there on the horizon. Mr. Revere, get your horse because the British are coming. If there was a day that started the British invasion, it was February 9th, 1964, when the Beatles would make their American debut on The Ed Sullivan Show. But in the months leading up to this, the Beach Boys were oh so unsuspectingly working on a new record. But when the tides changed, and when this new style, sound, and culture reached the ears of Brian Wilson, he outright thought of scrapping the record because he didn't think that it would compete with the new sound he was hearing. Despite that inclination, however, the record would be released in March 1964, Shut Down Volume 2.
Well, it's been building up inside of me for I don't know how long. I don't know why, but I keep thinking something's bound to go wrong.
Now I hear what you're saying. You're saying Shut Down. I know that from hit Beach Boys album Surfin U.S.A. and hit Beach Boys album Little Deuce Coupe. I see the fellas. They're right there. They aren't hiding because I see the cars too. This is a sequel car concept album. You aren't fooling me, Mr. Wilson. Well, first off, two things. Do you know what the record Shut Down is? It isn't Little Deuce Coupe. It isn't even the second half of Surfin U.S.A., which begins with Shut Down. It's actually this compilation record released by Capitol in 1963. Sure, it has 2 Beach Boys tracks on it, but it's really just a series of car-themed songs. So yeah, this is a sequel, but it's a sequel to a weird sort of spin-off. And is it really a second car concept record? The short answer is no, that's absurd, of course it isn't. But the other short answer is, it actually is. Coming off of a record like Little Deuce Coupe, where the titles alone tell you how much of a car-themed record it is, and on top of that, the lyrical content is sometimes so unbelievably specific, it can almost teach you about these cars. The same can easily apply to some of the tracks here. We have blatant examples of car apologetics with This Car of Mine, and a bit of added extracurricular activity with In the Parking Lot. But the best use of locomotion in lyrics comes in the subtleties of this record. And I'll give you an example, right? Fun, fun, fun. It's about a car, but also not really. It's more about the series of events that emerge because of the existence of a car, and the perceived freedom that cars get you when you're young. It's a great upbeat rockin' song, and a great way to kick the record into gear. But the best example of a car as a theme to a Beach Boys song is the first unequivocal Brian Wilson masterpiece, Don't Worry Baby. But before I explain, we need some context. Famously, Phil Spector and the Ronettes released Be My Baby in August 1963 to wide acclaim. But this song had more impact on Brian Wilson than perhaps any other song has in the history of music. Brian became obsessed with the song, and he frequently cites it as the best song ever written. And as such, Brian drew much inspiration in creating his own wall of sound, very Phil Spector-esque melodic masterpiece in Don't Worry Baby. This song signifies so much for the band, I can't even express how important this was. Firstly, this track was recorded without the use of session musicians, meaning only the Beach Boys played on this track. And I think that immediately dispels any preconceptions regarding the skills of the members, while also amplifying Brian's importance in presenting the band with material appropriate for them to play. And here we clearly hear Brian's jazz influence in the arrangements, with the surprisingly sophisticated changes and the 7th chords. It all gives the song a much more professional, produced feel, more comparable to Spector's arrangements than many of Brian's fellow surf rock acts. Even saying all that, the lyrics take it to a whole new level, because this song is about a car race. Brian sings, I guess I should have kept my mouth shut when I started to brag about my car, but I can't back down now because I pushed the other guys too far. This is a song about a kid who talked a big game about his car and found himself participating in a race, and now he's afraid that something will go wrong. It really is that simple. And I mean, sure, saying that, it sounds plenty goofy in a way, but it's also much more in line with the heart and the sentiment of something like In My Room, as opposed to anything off Little Deuce Coupe. And I think it shows a remarkable maturity in writing to take the concept of a car and a car race and turn it into a song that is so remarkably removed from anything from their previous album, both lyrically and musically. JFK Assassination. Would you guess that the fellas wrote a song on that exact day? Would you guess that that song was The Warmth of the Sun? There's a beauty and a loss portrayed throughout this album, and this song is a great example of it. It almost evokes a feeling of the impending downfall of the California dream, moving into a darker time, far before that ever came to fruition, with Brian singing, The love of my life, she left me one day. I cried when she said I don't feel the same way. Still, I have the warmth of the sun within me tonight. And this album also features the first Beach Boys song to exceed 3 minutes. That's a weird criteria, but it's true. And maybe that isn't very noteworthy, but maybe it shows even more ambition from the band. Or maybe it's the band's first attempt at, that's right, you guessed it, sketch comedy appearing on this record with everyone's favorite song, Cassius Love versus Sonny Wilson. Just smack dab in the middle of side 1, a 3.5-minute series of cornball jokes and goofy re-recordings of older songs. It certainly is something, and that sort of leads into the problem with this album, and why Brian almost wished to not release it. This record has quite a lot of filler, and I can say that from the side of Brian Wilson, as he expressed the same sentiment in the subsequent years. The pretend feud is here, and as much as I can enjoy it, it is completely out of place. And we also have the last 3 tracks on this record, which I honestly don't enjoy very much at all. Shutdown 2 is fine, but as an instrumental it feels a bit uninspired and really just unnecessary, especially when we have the remarkably comparable original Shutdown. But that's nothing compared to whatever Denny's Drums is, which is just a 2-minute drum solo to end the record. And both of these tracks sandwich a remarkably unremarkable cover of Louie Louie. So unfortunately, this is once again a sort of a sloppy album. It has undoubtedly some of the band's best material that they've created to this point, but it also has some completely worthless songs that I would honestly rather never hear again in my life. But hold on, because once again, in between albums, we see a lot that is happening behind the scenes and culturally. Papa Wilson was fired as the band's manager for being too overbearing and disruptive to the band. Now, I didn't touch on it much earlier, but Murray Wilson is a very controversial figure, as it is well documented that he was fairly abusive to his children. Allegedly, the physical punishments he dealt to Brian caused him to go deaf in his right ear. The exact cause of the affliction hasn't been proven, though I will say, as much as I don't want to force too much unnecessary speculation at any point in this video, all accounts point to Murray being specifically physically abusive. But good news, because for now he is fairly pushed out of the scene. Also, after the release of Shutdown Volume 2, it performed fairly poorly for the band, being the first album since their debut to fail to make the top 10. We could of course speculate why this may be, but why speculate when we have the British invasion? The Beatles were becoming widely popular in the US, particularly in early 1964. But Brian saw this as a competition, and a competition he had no intention of losing. Sure, Shutdown 2 might not have been the best first retaliatory move, but Brian knew that. And next time, he would get them. And Brian's next move in this battle of wits came at the height of summer in July 1964, with All Summer Long. I Get Around was the band's first #1 hit in the US. That's on this album. Still to this day, it's one of the band's longest lasting singles with an irrefutable hook. But besides that, All Summer Long, Little Honda, Wendy, Girls on the Beach, these are all classic early Beach Boys tracks, certainly rivaling anything they had done up to this point. And we also have one of my personal favorite early tracks with We'll Run Away. Here we get the first glimpse of a theme that will become ever more popular in the near future with Beach Boys releases, that being the subject of coming of age. And we even get some really whack moments in the now recurring theme of sketch comedy with our favorite recording sessions. This song is at least mercifully shorter than the band's previous attempt, and, it's placed at a much more respectable place, being the penultimate track on this record. And I could go on and on about the minute details of this record, such as the flawless vocal from Brian in Don't Back Down, that single-handedly carries the song with more grit than I've heard from the band. Or that moment in Wendy where they keep in a cough and studio chatter in the background, and how that hints to some of the more interesting experimentation quirks of something like Smile. But I will save us all some time and just say that this is the first undoubted ACIB stamp of approval. Now, what is the ACIB stamp of approval, you might ask? To be honest with you, I don't know. Okay, I could say that these are the most influential albums, most important, all that sort of nonsense, but I really don't think that's true. So let's just say that the stamp of approval is my sign of the channel, which I will try to think of, remarkable collections of work, interesting experiments, or just some of the most meaningful albums I have ever heard. don't take it too seriously, but also please debate my choices in the comments, because I know that I'll have some questionable takes in there, and that's just part of the fun of this, isn't it? So you can tell me why I'm completely wrong that, I don't know, Little Deuce Coupe's the best Beach Boys album. I'm looking forward to that. But as a record goes, this is a remarkable collection of songs that is clearly the culmination of years of work nailing a very particular surf rock sound. And while there may not be any jokes about the froth on a chocolate shake, this is the first time that the fellas actually write the liner notes themselves. Reading these and knowing some context about the particular members and how they behave, I guess, for lack of a better term, it really gives some interesting insight into the boys at this time. Al's blurb is very wholesome. He thanks the fellas, talks about how important this is to him, and thanks everyone for being so good to the band. And Carl's echoes a very similar sentiment, specifically thanking his mother, father, brothers, and the audience, saying that he hopes they are proud of the band. Dennis is a bit more rowdy in his, bragging about his fast life, his cars, girls, and all that, but that's just pure Dennis. But now I'm going to read the last two verbatim. Mike Love writes, "They've given me this small space to express something a guy could write a book about. There are 1,000 memories, like being on stage in our own state capital, Sacramento, California, and seeing so many happy, swinging kids going wild. And then there's the helpless feeling of seeing a girl who maybe spent her last dollar to see us crying or something, because the cops won't let her stay and get a Beach Boys autograph. Some of the people I've met since the Beach Boys started have become really special to me. I hope you know what I'm trying to say. It's more than just thank you. Like I said, you really can't say it all in such a small space. Maybe I'll get another chance sometime. Mike Love." Now, I am not the biggest Mike Love hater in the world, and I'll get that out right off the bat. And I want to be as objective as possible in assessing everything in this video. But this man did several things with this comment. Firstly, half of it is just complaints about shows, police, and even the space he has to write, which it seems a little self-interested for a place that probably should be a dedication to the fans. But on top of that, he is the only person, besides Al Jardine, that references the band as the Beach Boys. And this is really interesting because it sort of makes sense for Al, he isn't part of the family and maybe he sees his inclusion in this effort to be something potentially beyond him. And I have some sympathy for that feeling. But Mike Love is, and especially at this point, a central focus of the band, and yet he abstracts the name into a place that sounds, dare I say, extremely corporate. Like it is some business entity, and not just a name given to the collection of his cousins and friends that make music together. But now, let's look at Brian's. People ask me sometimes how I come up with my ideas. Sometimes I don't know. The feelings you get from going to school, being in love, winning and losing in sports, these are my inspirations. A sociologist might say I'm trying to generate a feeling of social superiority. I live with my piano and I love to make records that all my friends like to hear. The fellas have worked so well with me, you'd never know that we were brothers and cousins. Thank you for giving me the incentive to create our records. Sincerely, Brian Wilson. This feels earnest, true, and pure Brian. The comments about the sociologist is so out of nowhere. I mean, just looking at the words is funny. He isn't complaining, he isn't abstracting the band into some corporate identity beyond the fellas. He's saying thank you for giving me the incentive to create our records, and I think that says a lot. Anyways, after the momentary disappointment that was Shutdown Volume 2, the boys are right back. This record charted at number 4 on the US Billboard, and everything was seeming to go exactly correctly for them, moving back in the right direction. And the fellas did release a fairly noteworthy live album in October, and spoiler alert, and get the sirens ready, because this was the only record that the band created. There was not a compilation album that hit number 1 in the United States. This is partly tragic, but partly understandable since, of course, this is the only Beach Boys album to feature the Monster Mash. Anyways, next is the Christmas album. Yeah, and after the success of the band's Christmas single, Little Saint Nick, the prior year, it makes sense for them to attempt to capitalize and release a full Christmas album. And I know Christmas albums aren't given too much credence in terms of expected quality. However, it's important to know that this album is also an example of Brian Wilson's competitive spirit. After all, Phil Spector released a very popular Christmas record the prior year, and we know how much Brian admired and competed with Phil Spector, so really, Brian should be giving this record his all. But still, I mean, think of what a Beach Boys Christmas record would be in your head, and bingo, that's exactly what you get here. Naturally, Christmas is a holiday of tradition, so there are traditional covers on this album, but adventurously, there are also 5 wholly new compositions here too, of course including the earlier release of Little Saint Nick. All of the original songs are very musically interesting, and they feature a very different musical vocabulary than most of their earlier work, at least in so much as you can hardly hear any surf rock influence at all in the writing. There are 7th chords all over the place, and it gives the album a very good sense of place and almost a jazzy atmosphere, very appropriate for an intimate, warm-sounding Christmas record. But that level of care and ingenuity doesn't stop with these compositions. And this is because all of the cover songs here feature a full-on 41-piece orchestra. I mean, you hear the same classic harmonies and approach to vocals that you have come to expect, along with a continuation of Brian's studio experimentation with what is essentially a whole new arena of sounds to work with. And I understand, this is a Christmas album, and this is not something that is going to likely blow you away. But it is interesting, new, and probably worth hearing. So if you were thinking about passing on this one, I would still say definitely, listen to it at least once. And just like that, we are at the end of 1964. The Beach Boys are reclaiming their spot. They're artistically innovating, accepting the challenge that is the British invasion. And Brian gets married to Marilyn Ravel. Now, Miss Ravel was a singer herself, being part of a group called the Honeys, which included her sister and cousin. And that kind of reminds me of something. Now, a Christmas album is a bit specific. It almost implies that you're supposed to listen to it on Christmas or around Christmas, and the Beach Boys noticed this and fixed it on their next release, the first album of 1965, The Beach Boys Today. That's right, listen to it right now. Now, from an outside look, we are at the best the band has ever been. A #1 single, massive touring success, Brian's new marriage. It would be hard to paint a better picture. And what do they give us? The most melancholic, introspective, and romantic album they have even come close to attempting at this point. There is no surf here. There is no summer at all. This is a monumental period of change for the band. And part of this is because Brian was actually not in a good mental space at all during this time. The recent marriage was rushed, and the pressure I'm sure that he felt given his position in the changing tides of popular music caused him to have a nervous breakdown. And I don't mean this in a hyperbolic way, he actually broke down while on a flight, and infamously this breakdown caused him to stop touring with the band. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, this was when Brian was first introduced to marijuana. And I say that only because Brian credits a lot of his new approach to writing to his use of the drug. So let's talk about this new approach. Something a lot of people will mention when talking about this album is that it is pretty well split down the middle. The A-side is much more upbeat and rockin', while the B-side is filled with ballads. Now that doesn't sound too revolutionary, but that's until you hear it. As I mentioned, you can hear pretty much no surf rock influence anywhere on this album. Even the focal instruments of the band, being primarily guitar, piano, bass, and drums, have been completely overhauled. You get French horns, accordion, saxophones, mandolin, and many other instruments that would be fairly foreign to the Beach Boys' catalog all throughout this record. Though, for an album called Today, it is deeply distressed with Tomorrow. A lot of these songs are almost depressing accounts of having fears of the future in relationships or just life in general. And that would likely be expected from side 2, knowing that it's more ballad-heavy. But even on side 1, you get When I Grow Up, Don't Hurt My Little Sister, and Help Me Rhonda. No H, of course, remember, no H. And they're all prime accounts of this theme as well. They all deal with the concept of the future, coming of age, and finding your place in this world. But Brian, of course, likely knows that this is a different direction for the band, and reasonably starts the record with some of the more rocking tracks, such as the cover of Do You Wanna Dance, which is a great energetic start to the record, right up there with I Get Around, and it probably has Dennis's best vocal performance yet. But now let's talk about the apparent genius that is side 2, the thing that everyone talks about when talking about this record. The whole side is just as lush, detailed, and cinematic as side 1, but this time, The songs are much more down-tempo and melancholic. Please Let Me Wonder shows Brian grasping with the concept of unrequited love. And I'm So Young, in a way, is just a bit of a redux of We'll Run Away, but it doesn't really feel like it. It talks about the promise of the future when building relationships, while also simultaneously dealing with the fact that the present is difficult enough. And She Knows Me Too Well is a frighteningly earnest look into the concept of jealousy in relationships. I get so jealous of the other guy, and then I'm not happy till I make her break down and cry. When I look at the other girls, it must kill her inside, but it'd be another story if she looked at the guys. Now, I hear what you're saying. You're saying, but what about the sketch comedy songs? Those were my favorites. Don't let me miss out on one of those. Well, bad news, old buddy, old chap, okay? Because we don't have one here. What we get instead is the fellas getting, recording, and eating a nice meal with the closing tracks, bowl sessions with the quote, Big Daddy. Yeah, we don't get Guess I'm Dumb. We get You Sure Are. Sorry, Brian, hate to hit you with that one. It isn't funny. It isn't a song. It really isn't anything at all. It's too short to be insightful or interesting, and the fact that it's here at all, I'm sure, detracts from the record in the eyes of many, and that is unfortunate. Now, even considering the monumental change that this record was, it's still charted at number 4 in the US, which is a rare instance of the commercial and critical reception of albums being properly aligned in this story. And it's proof that, look, Brian's experimentation and change of sound didn't harm their commercial performance, at least nowhere near as much as you may believe. Barring the Big Daddy, of course, every single track here is fantastic, and it's a record that has continued to grow on me every single time that I hear it. Another undoubted ACIB stamp of approval. But now it's another question time. Are you ready, ladies and gentlemen? Get ready in the comments. Guess how many records this band made in the year 1965? Did you guess 3? Because you'd be correct. Because 3 years in a row. 3 albums a year? Okay. So what is number 2? Is it another dive into well-orchestrated melancholy? Ladies and gentlemen, the suit is off and we are getting tragic. Okay? First off, sorry about the biggest cliffhanger in 2025. That was not my intention. I fully intended on releasing this whole 4-hour thing as one big video, big celebration, big last hurrah, if you will. Until then, life hit me with an ACIB stamp of disapproval, ladies and gentlemen. The full video, the full history of the Beach Boys was initially intended to be about 4 hours long, so this is only a very, very, very small portion of that. It's fully written, but I figured that making you wait all that time for the full video to be done would be absolutely absurd, so I might as well get out what I've done so far. So again, sorry about the cliffhanger. Maybe you're going to be hanging for a while, I don't know. But, we'll see.